Welcome to Survivor Voices Show with me, your hostess, Kocsis. I am the author of Cult Child and other publications, which you can explore on my website, VennieKocsis.com. That is VennieKocsis.com. Survivor Voices Show is dedicated to providing a platform for trauma survivors to tell our stories in a safe space. Each show will bring you a plethora of topics from authors to artists, survivors living with impairments, healing journeys, updated news, and real, raw, vulnerable moments of laughter and sometimes tears. Find me on Twitter using hashtag Survivor Voices. Connect with me on Facebook at Survivor Voices Show page. Join our Facebook group, Survivor Voices, where you will find support and be embraced as you share your life. Thank you for being here. And now, here is our show. Dear friend of mine, John Huddle, on, and he is a survivor of Word of Faith Fellowship Cult, which is in the news right now, being reported on by the Associated Press. And his book is free today, and I really, really encourage you to grab it for Kindle. It's an amazing read. It really lays out how you get lured into a cult, the slow climb of the changes that are made. People who've never been in a cult seem to have a misconception that, one day you're okay and the next day you're in a cult, and it just doesn't happen that way. And reading John's book will help you understand how does an adult get lured into the slow climb of a cult like Jane Whaley's. If you want a fast link to download his book, you can visit facebook.com/Survivor Voices Show. Please follow the page as well. I would really appreciate it. You'll get to see who the next guest is and things like that. Also on Twitter, you can follow me at Vennie Kocsis, and there's also a link up there to get John's book for free. So John is going to update us on what's going on with not only the case of Matthew Fenner, who Word of Faith Fellowship essentially kidnapped and put through quite a brutal beating session because it was indicated that he might possibly be gay. And one of the things that really stands out to me in that, most of all, is that he said there were many times through that situation he didn't know if he was going to die. And so that court case is going on, as well as a court case of human trafficking where the church has brought up people from Brazil. So I'm going to go ahead and bring John on and let him give us the details since he follows this extremely closely. And John, welcome to the show, and thank you so much for being here with me.
Hello, Vinny. Thank you for having me again today.
Yeah, I'm so excited and really want to know. I mean, I've followed a little bit of what's been going on. I don't know if you want to share a little bit about, how you came to be a part of this church and this organization, just to catch up anybody who maybe doesn't know your story. Of course, again, they can get your book for free and read it, but maybe you could summarize it a little bit.
Okay. In 1992, my wife and I and our little girl moved to Greenville, South Carolina to be a part of a church that was pastored by Gerald and Linda Sutherland. Shortly after we got there, we began to hear about all the great things that were happening in Spindale at Word of Faith Fellowship. And soon into that year, in the May seminar, during the month of May, we attended the May seminar at Word of Faith Fellowship. That was our first meeting there. And once you're immersed in a group that is entangled in a closed subculture or and essentially a religious cult, there are several dynamics that begin to take place and can slowly displace your perception of reality and your understanding of what's going on. One of the first things, just real quickly, one of the first things that we noticed when we got there is that as we met people of the Greenville church, they were instant friends. And we were the best thing since sliced bread, and glad to have you, we'll do anything for you. And later I learned that that's one of the techniques of being recruited into a closed subculture group, is the love bombing.
Yes.
So it is something you want to hear. Everybody wants friends. Everybody wants wants to be accepted at some level in some way. And so that happened, and we began to be a part of the Greenville church, started traveling back and forth to the Word of Faith church. 10 years later, the leader of Word of Faith Fellowship, Jane Whaley, visited the Greenville church and announced that God had told her that it was time for the Greenville church to come be a part of the things in Spindale. And through the next few months, we made arrangements to move. October of 2002, we moved into a communal living situation with another family involved in the church. And from there, we began to see the inside of life at Word of Faith Fellowship. I detail a lot of the pivotal services, the pivotal decisions made by Jane and leadership in my book. And from there, it was an eye-opening experience. But the eyes open slowly because the heart is caught up in wanting to believe what you're being told.
Yeah, your book is really revealing, especially about how like the rules were slowly changed. You know, again, it's not always it's never a very swift change. It's slow, where a few rules are implemented, then a few more added on, and before you know it, you have this list of rules where every single portion of your day is monitored and controlled. And I really saw how she did that. I wanted to ask you, how did the Sutherlands feel? Did they feel like they were being, you know, undermined a little bit by Jane Whaley, or were they excited to merge with her?
As the weeks passed after January of '02, we learned that Gerald Sutherland had a hard time with accepting, quote unquote, the will of God. His wife, his son, his daughter-in-law we're going to Spindale whether you go or not. And so he had a choice to make. Was he going to lose his family to a church in 59 miles north in North Carolina? Or was he going to accept it as the direction that, quote unquote, God had for him to close down the ministry where he was, that he had been running several years? I don't know exactly, maybe as many as 20 years or more, and go be a part of Word of Faith Fellowship in Spindale. And after what he says are some agonizing days, he decided to go to Spindale.
Yeah, that sounds really familiar with what the cult did to my mother. It was the same ultimatum to my father. She really, after those 4 years of her handler working on her, was convinced that the end of the world was nigh, the communists were coming to destroy us, and it was the same way. I'm joining this commune whether you want to or not. And my father said, no way, you know, but it broke him. It's a horrible choice for anybody to have to make in regards to their family. And he did essentially lose his family because of that. So I can relate, after talking with him now as an adult, to what Mr. Sutherland the agony emotionally that he must have been in.
Yes. It was a pivotal time, not only in the work, the ministry that he'd been doing, but in his personal life, because there were services where he was allowed to preach, and then he was publicly corrected by Jane Whaley, the leader, in front of everybody, and had to either fall in line or openly rebel against leadership, which he knew would cost him his family. Things as simple, I got to give you this example, just real quick. he was talking one day, and I know this, for some that are not familiar with this type of organization, you're going to think, why would he be talking about shampoo? But one day he was talking about his shampoo in his bathroom that had a quote unquote new age statement on it. And he was saying something along the lines of, I ignored it, it didn't bother me, I didn't let it touch me. And Jane Whaley piped up and said, get rid of it, and screamed it real loud. And he said, all of a sudden, I think I need a new shampoo.
Wow.
And so to give a little context, he'd been in the military, so when it was time to do an about face, he was being trained to do that.
Mm-hmm.
And but incidences like that where his direction was changed, his thinking was on display and changed, not only were a power play from Jane Whaley, but set an example for other people to say, if Gerald has to change like that, then who are we to say we can go against the group think, go against the mindset set by the cult leader? Of course, you don't call it a cult when you're on the inside. You
Right.
quote unquote the will of God.
Yeah, yeah. I never heard the word cult, of course, until years later. I mean, I was a kid, of course, but yeah, gosh, I familiarized with that so much. I mean, it is those tiny ways of taking control, the music you listen to, the books that you read, the way that you're told to dress and behave. It really, I know that I grew up in a cultish environment where there was no safe place for me. I couldn't trust anyone. They create so much mistrust that you never know, like, who's an informant, who's watching you, who's going to go tell. So you're always on eggshells.
Exactly. There's that alertness, that constant defensiveness on the inside of defending what may be construed as a wayward thought or contrary thought. I mean, you weren't allowed to doubt the authority of the leader. And when you talk about mistrust, it went so far as the years go on, your children would report you for infractions, and that's another case that happened with me. I mean, spouses would turn on spouses, children would turn on parents, because it was put out there that if you didn't tell on somebody who was breaking a rule or showing a sin, that it was in you.
Right.
So you didn't want to be guilty of their sin in your thinking, so you would rat them out.
And also I noticed, I was a very observant child, and so I really watched the women. There was a lot of competition. So another way that I would see that they would, snitch, for lack of a better word, would be to hopefully gain some favor, some accolades. I mean, sometimes it seemed like people would report others, out of their own ego, like, I'm going to get special treatment because if I tell on this person, then that's going to show how deep my faithfulness is.
Exactly. And just real quickly, I was reminding of this particular incident. And first of all, before I say something about my children, they are a result of where I led them to. So it's not as if I have any animosity when I say this. I take my responsibility. But there was a time closer to my departure, which I ended up leaving in July of 2008. And Bill Clinton had come to the small town where I lived in Marion, North Carolina. He was campaigning at the time for his wife. And it was on the front page of the paper, which had the display stand at the post office. And so that's, I mean, relative to the small town of Marion, North Carolina, where I live, Bill Clinton coming there was a big deal. I mean, it doesn't matter what side of the fence you're on, this is a historic figure. And so that night, I was talking to my daughter before she went to bed, and they were talking about current events in their class at school. And I said, well, did anybody tell you that Bill Clinton came to Marion? She said, no, Dad, how did you know that? I said, it was on the front page of the paper. So the very next church service, one of the church leadership confronted me and said, did you have any conviction that you weren't supposed to be reading that and telling your daughter about it? I said, no conviction. And so that was one of the over-the-top steps that began to led to my separation from the group is when I openly said, no, I had no conviction about not reading the front page of a newspaper with a historic figure coming to a small town, and then telling my daughter about it. So I don't know if you can relate to that or not, but it's...
Oh, I can relate to it. I mean, we were censored completely. An example would be, and I write about this in Cold Child. We would get National Geographic magazines, but before they were distributed for anyone to look at, they were gone through. So anything that the leaders felt that was inappropriate was torn out. So you would be reading the magazine, there would be missing pages, or maybe half of a page was cut out, especially if it was anything about indigenous groups who, you know, didn't wear all of their clothing or they showed breasts or anything like that. That was definitely cut out. At one time, they started letting us read Life magazine. That was that's very much in my memory because I was really obsessed with Lady Diana as a young girl, and they would allow those stories in. But if you recall, there was a story about her that was controversial because she wore a skirt that was see-through one time, and there was a photo taken of it. So you could read that story, but they cut that picture out. So that was considered too risque for us to be able to see. So yeah, I can relate to that censorship. We were never taught about slavery. You know, our whole academic world was censored. They taught us what they wanted to, and they didn't have to adhere to anybody's curriculum.
Right. Well, at least you got access to magazines. We did not have free access to magazines, newspapers, television, radio, internet on a free basis. There was a complete restriction of the information going in that group, into the group. And just as a side note, here lately, with some of the work the Associated Press has been doing in investigative reporting of the group, it was told to me that at one point the cell phones, at least for the young people, were confiscated by the leadership of the group inside the group. Not only to find out what's on them, but to restrict their access to the AP reports.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, there was only one telephone where I grew up. We didn't have any electricity, or we didn't have any running water or anything like that. But
wow.
Things changed after our cult leader died. There were some changes made. That's when we started being able to get magazines in, but still extremely censored. But I mean, think about also just that also takes away any connection to emergency services as well. To take those people's cell phones, they can't dial 911 if they're in any type of situation. You know, it also takes away their connection to safety, really, too.
Yes. Yes.
That's a horrible way to live. And it's so interesting too when you're inside of it. I mean, again, I was a child, so I was kind of, I was very intuitive, so I was always like, this doesn't feel right, but you have to act a certain way or you're going to get punished. So it was either like take a beating or just comply. And you wonder how many people inside of in their hearts and in their minds, they know they're questioning, but you're too terrified to talk to anybody about your doubts.
It's hard to get a read on that. I know that for certain that the outward controls of the behavior, information, attempting to control thought processes and emotions are some of the key factors. But when it comes to laying down at night and before you get quiet and go to sleep, those are the times, at least for me, when I begin to reflect on my day and begin to, well, as a first generation going into a group like that, you have a comparison reality. But for children growing up in a group like that, they do not have a comparison reality. And they cannot compare their day to something normal.
Right. You know, I had somebody just ask in the chat room who is to blame, the cult, the parents, or the victims. My personal opinion, is the cult, because you're dealing with narcissists. And I can tell you, anybody can be duped. Anyone. We had accountants, lawyers, doctors, people who left behind hundreds of thousands of dollars that they gave over to the cult that they had made in their lifetime. It is the narcissist's fault. They are to blame, and they are the full enactor of the mind control. I blamed my mother for a very long time, hated her for a very long time, until I matured and realized that, yes, my mother is accountable for what she did, but she was a victim as well. And I don't think if they had told my mother, hey, join our cult where your children are going to be raped and beaten, she would have been like, let's go. No, it doesn't work like that. They
No.
feed you a story. They love bomb you. And by the time you're in, it's like an abusive relationship where, you know, the partner is, I love you, I love you. And then a year later, you find yourself, you're being beaten or you're being mentally abused, and your mind is rocked going, how the heck did I get here?
Yes, yes. It's a gradual transfer. Well, between the husband and wife, it's a gradual transfer of the center of the relationship being between the man and the wife. Well, the word escapes me just in a second, but the center of the decisioning process being between the man and the woman and being transferred to the leadership of the church, where you go ask the leadership of the church things that you and your wife should be determining, whether how to raise the children, how to administer the finances of the home, how to make decisions where to live, what car to drive, what clothes to wear. I mean, inside the group I was a part of, all those decisions were purview of the leader. And if you got it wrong, you missed God. You were in danger of missing the will of God and the move of God by not having the right clothes. Now, that doesn't even make sense. But
You know, it makes me think back to, you know, the F word and what it apparently stands for, which was that you could not fornicate without the consent of the king. So a sign would be put on your door, fornicating under consent of the king, where either back in that old, right, even back in that old religion, couples were having to ask permission to have relations. That to me is all generationally passed down and was sent over here to the New World when the religious came here, and it was equally enacted. I mean, that's John. I wanted to talk with you because I watched this video that you went to a town hall meeting, and I really watched this man enact some pretty subtle NLP on you, where you said, hey, you know, I gave you my book. Have you read it? He kind of just said, yeah, I have your book, and then completely just shut you down by moving to another topic. So I wanted to know if you wanted to maybe get into that and share a little bit with the audience what that was about.
Yes. Thank you, Vennie. Congressman Patrick McHenry is the representative for the Rutherford County area which is where Word of Faith Fellowship is located. And so earlier in August, he was scheduled to have a town hall meeting and was reported a few days before that to have pneumonia, and so it got postponed until later in the month. And I've been to several gatherings pertaining to, you know, court hearings and protest or whatever when it comes to this group. This is my first time at a town hall meeting. And to be honest with you, the first thing I noticed was the level of security. Had to pass through metal detectors. And there were county level and maybe federal level, I didn't recognize the other group, of law enforcement in the building. So my purpose for going was to not only ask him about the book, but to ask him if he was aware and what he could say about his knowledge of the Associated Press investigation that had been, the first article dropped the 27th of February, the next one was the 6th of March, and they've been outlining the abuses inside of Word of Faith as told by 43 survivors. And They've gone through mountains of documents. The Associated Press has dedicated man hours, time, money, resources, and has even filed a couple of motions in the Fenner case to get the gag order lifted, which I'm getting a little ahead of myself, but I'll explain that too. So I wanted to know his reaction to that, and if he had been briefed about the investigation that had been confirmed in the recent press sources by the U.S. Attorney Jill Rose. And so I stood up to ask my question, and he said there was no briefing. He had not been briefed. Then he relegated himself to the status of a private citizen, which I thought was, pretty much of a stretch. I mean, you're Congressman Patrick McHenry. You're not a private citizen. Mm. And then he went on to try to give me a 6th grade education in government structure. I mean, you saw the video. Yes. Is that what it was?
Yeah, I would say, I mean, he definitely halfway answered your question. Yeah, have your book. No, haven't been briefed. And then let's talk about it. I mean, it was just like, if I was to give someone an example of how politicians use NLP to mess with people's minds through language, that would be a perfect one of watching what he did.
Right. It leads me. One of the things I learned, actually, Vennie, after this meeting, I did a little research, and it's just in the beginning steps, but people in his position, congressmen, do not have to have a security clearance. He does not have to be vetted for a top secret security clearance. And I think that is, that was a shock to me. Now, I did learn that senators and congressmen in certain areas have to sign oaths of secrecy for the information that is divulged to them about our government. But they are not vetted for security clearances as other people are for jobs inside the government. Mm-hmm. So, anyway, the video was the first question that I asked. Now, what is not clear in the video, was not clear in my posting, is that there was about 30 cult members there. Wow. They're heavy into the Republican Party in that area. Mm-hmm. So, for him to answer the question, he was talking to supporters.
Right.
So, after the meeting, towards the end of the meeting, a lady brought up the subject of immigration. And that would have been a lead-in, but she was actually told she was the last question. We were going to have someone else stand up and ask a question about the recent Brazilian scandal that had been revealed by the Associated Press. And just to recap that, the Associated Press dropped an article recently, and in that article, it outlines the way young Brazilians brought up by Word of Faith Fellowship from São Paulo area were required to work for free or little to no pay for companies owned by church leaders or in homes of church leaders as a quote unquote, they're part of learning the ministry. And it's as reported, several visa violations, several infractions at different levels. And so he said he was aware of these infractions of these articles reported by the Associated Press. He had not been briefed in the investigation. Now then, after the meeting with Congressman Patrick McHenry, Jill Rose, the U.S. Attorney for the Western District of North Carolina, was quoted in another news source of saying that the investigation into the infractions has gotten traction both in America and Brazil. Just as a side note, after the article from the Associated Press dropped, I was contacted by Globo.com, and they are the largest, if not the largest, at least the second largest media source in South America. And they were sending representatives to Rutherford County to get a news story about how Brazilians were being treated. I was interviewed for that article, and it aired on a Sunday night a few weeks ago. Oh, wow. And it was really interesting being involved with the Brazilian press. and hearing their take and their perspective of how their citizens were being treated.
Can I ask you, John, give us some examples when the workers were brought here to the United States. How were they treated? And were there different rules for them inside of the cult? Can you give us a few scenarios so we can get a really clear picture? I mean, aside from, I'm sure, not getting paid, did they have different living conditions? What kind of things were going on inside of the cult with them?
Well, I can repeat what was in the Associated Press article. Several of the ones interviewed for that article said their passports were taken from them for quote unquote safekeeping, and there were reports of having to work domestic chores inside of leaders' homes, take care of their children for no pay, cooking their meals, ironing their clothes, different things like that. Other Brazilian young men were required to work for little to absolutely no pay in remodeling of apartments and homes, and that was in the AP article.
Were other members of the church, like American citizens, were they doing the same work and getting paid, and or were they not doing the work at all because the Brazilian people were being brought up to do it?
Now that was one of the points brought out in the article. A lot of the Americans were getting paid and the Brazilians weren't.
Wow. And then where does that money go when they get paid? Does a lot of it get funneled back into the church?
Well, at Word of Faith Fellowship, there was one misnomer put out in the community years ago that everybody handed in their paycheck, got back an allowance. I never knew that to be the truth. I do know that at some particular points in the history of the church, somebody would pick up the paychecks from a central location, go cash them, and give them back to the members. But in that group, there was great pressure for not only tithing, but giving offerings and raising fundraisers and buying this and buying that and donating and all kinds. I mean, there were some services where the plates would be passed 3 and 4 times. In fact, one leader got up and said, just give it all the first time.
Yeah, you had told me that one time. I know the last time we talked, you had told an interesting story that Jane Whaley did one time about the money. Do you know what I'm talking about? Where she was like, we're desperately needing this money, and then you found out she did something different with it?
Well, she came into the service one night and she said, we need $25,000 to meet the budget. You never knew what the budget was. All you knew that it wasn't getting met. There were no financial disclosures. So she said God had told her that there were people holding back money for their retirement, in essence, or inheritance, going to give it to their children, and God said to give that money. So they passed the plates, and they came back a few minutes later. She came in the sanctuary, and she was, the fake crying. Oh, she was boohooing. And we've had a miracle. We've gotten $50,000.
Wow.
Yeah. And I mean, at that time, the congregation was 450, maybe 500 people, including the children.
Mm-hmm.
So, and there were about 120 children, maybe. So you do the math. There were some people that gave big chunks of money that day.
Right. And so then you met the $25,000 quota, but then when you say, knowing that nonprofit articles of corporation and all of their finances are public knowledge, but this isn't something that you all were educated on. Surely you were very much kept from the age of technology as much as possible to know that you could research and see the financials if you wanted to. You just believed that she was doing good with the money as she stated that she was doing. Am I understanding?
Well, there were no quarterly reports. There were no monthly reports. If there were people other than Jane that knew the budget, it would have been the church secretary and maybe a few board members. But the budget was always in fact, I put it this way in my book. It was as if there was a big black hole in Jane's office where the money would go and you never know what happened to it. It just was this hungry black hole where you just kept throwing money in fundraisers, thousands and thousands of dollars. At one point, they said they needed $20,000 a week to meet the budget. you do the math, that's over $1 million running a church that size. To me, that seems a little, a little high.
What would have happened if someone had said, "I'd like to see the books"? How would she have reacted?
Well, there was an older gentleman who was actively participating in the raising the finances of the church, and he did ask the question in church one day, and he got called wicked and put in discipleship for even asking the question.
Because he was questioning God's authority, right?
Right. It shifted from being a matter of money to authority and power structure. At that point, he was questioning the power structure, and he got rebuked.
And publicly humiliated.
Right, exactly. But back to the meeting. Congressman McHenry opened up the meeting with a short synopsis of an update from Washington, different things, that had been happening. I was the first to get up and ask a question, and it was filmed by a couple different sources and put on the internet. And basically, as I sat down, I realized I missed my opportunity for a follow-up question because, quite frankly, it was my first time at a town hall meeting, and I believed what they said, and everybody only got one question. But as the night played out, that wasn't true. You could stand up and ask a follow-up question if you knew enough about it. So anyway, so I learned. So after the meeting broke up, we were outside with some friends, and one of my friends said, I lamented the fact that I was not able to ask my question. The state of the U.S. House of Representatives passed 3 bills in the month of July dealing with human trafficking. They've not been signed into law, but on his Facebook page, Congressman McHenry's Facebook page, on July 12th, he started bragging about these bills. And so I lamented the fact to one of my friends that I had not been able to ask him how those bills passed so far away in Washington would help apply to the local situation. Well, she looked at me and she said, "Why don't we just go back there and ask him? He's still in there." And so we strolled back in there, and as we were there, we noticed as the cult members came up, he began to call them by first name. So he was obviously familiar with the people from the group.
Wow.
And so we stood around, and he was turning to leave, and I got in his path, and I think he went to shake my hand. I can't remember that, but I said, "Congressman, I got one more question." He said, "I really need to go." And I asked him, I said, "On July 12th on your Facebook page, you mentioned there were 3 bills passed about human trafficking. How would they apply to the local situation, the Brazilian crisis that's being revealed by the Associated Press?" He cut me off. He said, "Take it to your local law enforcement, get an attorney," and turn around and walked away. So I had some witnesses. Somebody took it. There's a picture that I'll put on my blog. There's of he and I standing there making that exchange, and the look on his face is one of total disgust that I stopped him to ask the question.
Can you tell everyone what your blog is so that people have the address, so that they can follow? Because you write some great, really in-depth stories on there.
Thank you. I appreciate that. The blog is religiouscultsinfo.com. It's plural, cults plural. religiouscultsinfo.com. I'll be putting an update in the next day or so of the summary of the different events that have happened this week about the comments in the press by Jill Rose. Another fact or two about the meeting with Congressman Patrick McHenry. And I do follow the Matthew Fenner case on that blog. I do access different court documents and scan them in as PDFs and make them available to the public. So that the blog itself has morphed into a information source of a lot of the legal battles that go on between ex-members and Word of Faith Fellowship.
I want to ask you a really personal question. I'm curious about this with the children. As we have about probably maybe 7-8 minutes to talk about this before we go to another break. What were the rules, or what are the rules? I mean, of course, we know Matthew Fenner was basically put through a very violent exorcism. Are small children still put through those types of rituals? And my other question is, has there been any reports of sexual abuse within Jane Whaley's cult?
I left in July of '08, and the reports that I have are from recent people that have exited. Children are still prayed over. Small children are still prayed over. They're still, the signature practice of the group is the blasting prayer and deliverance is still administered to all members of the group. I don't know that anybody's totally exempt from that. In fact, if you don't want strong prayer and deliverance, it's hard to stay a part of the group, because that is, I don't think I would exaggerate to say that that's the blood flow of the group, that practice unifies them and makes a very strong us versus them mentality. You're part of us if you want that kind of prayer. You're them if you don't. Does that make sense?
Yes. Is there physical punishment?
Excuse me, ask the question again.
Is there physical punishment?
They do believe in spanking. They do believe in corporal punishment. They believe in separation, isolation, isolating those who don't adhere to the rules or don't display the correct behaviors, isolating them for them to get alone with their thoughts and separate them from their families at different times. In years past, they've had a lower building where the men were separated from their families because of the unclean. I think we talked about that last time. And the second part of your question was about, can you remind me?
Sure. Yeah. What I wanted to know was, are there any reports of sexual abuse of the children coming out of that cult?
Back in the early 90s, there was a case of a man accused of molesting a young girl, and it has come out in at least one of the AP reports that comments from the group leader made it seem like it was that girl's fault because she was 12 and she looked 20 or something like that was her comment. And so at different times there have been allegations of that. That's the most public one. There are reports, and I believe they are in the AP articles, where Jane, the leader, is recorded as saying, there's a recording that they played, the AP supplied, where she said she did not have to give authorities information about sexual abuse inside of her group because of pastoral, ministerial privileges, or whatever she called it, which is not true in the state of North Carolina.
And this is a problem. I mean, this is something I'm really passionate about, that a child's right, their human rights, as well as it's criminal behavior. Freedom of religion is suddenly, has overridden that over the last 50 years. I mean, even right now in Idaho, we keep mentioning this, where this faith healing goes on. It's going on the cult that I was on, which still exists, where a parent is allowed to pray their children into death, a very slow and suffering death. And there's no charges brought against them for maltreatment. And to me, that is a huge violation. If you want to tell us a little bit deeper about what happened with him.
Certainly. In January 27th of 2013, Matthew Fenner was in a prayer session after a Sunday night meeting, and a lot of what I'm saying right now came out in court testimony. So he, at the end of the service, he was confronted that something just wasn't right, that there were something working in him that was not the will of God. I mean, several little euphemistic labels, I'm sure, were put on it. And so he was prayed for. And In his words, the prayer became more violent than other sessions in previous times.
So just because something wasn't right, there was no definitive, we're not going to get a break, by the way, so we can just, let's just keep it rolling. There was no definitive reason given to him except, you know, something's off with you?
Well, think about it. That's another form of control. When someone comes up and says something doesn't feel right, then the pressure's on you to call them a liar or to give up something that's not right, that you know that is against the rules that you've been doing or participating in. So he felt pressure, according to, he admitted to having quote unquote unclean thoughts about a particular person. And that started the prayer.
Was that a same-sex person?
Yes.
Okay, so it would be fair to say that he was accused of being gay.
Right.
Okay.
Yes. And so as the prayer went on, it became more and more violent. He had recently had an outpatient surgery, I believe, on his back to remove some cancerous-looking spots. He had had cancer as a young child and survived and was under the direct care of a dermatologist and oncologist to remove the spots. And so he'd had that surgery a couple of days previous, and it was still bandaged at the time. And so he, as he says in his testimony that is out in different news sources, they were pushing on his chest and pushing him back and forth, had his hands on his back, and the numbers varied in the court testimony from 20 to more people standing around him screaming, and the prayer began to progress. And another young lady who was quote unquote his friend and walking out our friendship inside that group, that was that's what they termed, what the world would call dating, but it's not dating at all. So she was brought into the prayer session after it had already started, and in her testimony in court, she could tell that Matthew's color he was white as a sheet. That's what she said under oath, and that his physical condition was not good. So at one point they stopped the prayer, took him out into the sanctuary to talk to him privately, to get him to open up his heart, so to speak, and give him more details about these thoughts and the dreams. And then he took him back in the sanctuary, back into the foyer, then back into the sanctuary. So the meeting had several parts to it. And from that meeting, he talked about the fear in his heart and his mind if he would actually survive the meeting. In fact, under oath, the young lady testified she thought that this may be the first person that got killed during a prayer session.
Oh my gosh.
That came out in court testimony. She wondered that in her mind because of the way he was being treated.
This was a regular, was this a common occurrence, this type of behavior? I know that he'd been to court before. This wasn't the first time, correct? That there'd been an issue before, even the news. So was this something that happened often, or was this an extreme?
It was labeled extreme, but there was another witness in the same trial, which is let me back up. From the incident on the 27th of January 2013, after several months and after lots of effort, Matthew Fenner went into a grand jury hearing, was able to obtain indictments against 5 church members: Brooke Covington, Sarah Anderson, Robert Louis Walker, Adam Bailey, and Justin Covington. Now, in the trial earlier this year of Brooke Covington is the testimony that I'm talking about. Now, the trial ended in a mistrial when the foreman of the jury introduced illegal, unauthorized documents into the jury room. That's still under investigation. the people involved in that trial are under a gag order by the judge. They cannot even complete the investigation until the judge rules on the appeal, which the Associated Press put, of the gag order. Until he rules on the appeal, they can't complete the investigation of how these illegal documents got into the jury room.
Wow.
So it's a big mess.
What do you think, John? How do you think they got in there?
Well, there's cameras everywhere. Why would the cameras not have found who actually put the documents in there unless the cameras were turned off or were turned in a different direction? And the investigators, until they talk to the jurors and put the pieces together, will not know how those documents actually got in there, because the foreman had to walk by the judge every time he walked into the jury room.
So they were already in the room that the documents were. None of the jurors brought them in.
That's
or they don't know.
That's not clear. It's not, but I do know that he had to walk by the judge. Whatever's in his hands had to be. People watched him go in and out of the jury room every time. You had to walk by the judge to do that. So anyway, the Brooke Covington trial ended in a mistrial. I think it was June of this year. But during that, the testimony of the witnesses brought forth by the state, this is what I'm talking about. There was one witness who said that, and this is, I don't have my notes in front of me, but this is near a quote as I can get. The practice of the prayer evolved into a more violent form over the years she was there, and I believe that to be true. It wasn't as violent when I was there back in 2008 when I left. But somewhere after I left, the young ladies were encouraged to slap the young men in the face who had an unclean thought. That was an encouraged practice. And so I've been told by several survivors that the prayer morphed into oftentimes scrums, I guess I would call them, where people would lay on top of each other to try to, I don't even know what the goal was, but to get them, quote unquote, a breakthrough. So
was that ever done on children? Like, when I talk children, I'm like 12 and under. Was that practice used on them, that kind of pile up practice?
I can say this. I don't know specifically myself, but I can say that in December of 2015, there was a complaint lodged by an ex-member about abuses very similar to that in the school, where the children were allowed to beat up and bully each other. And during the DSS was called in for that investigation. During the investigation, what was reported to me was the cult leader was allowed to sit in on all the interrogations of the children. So how much free information were the children allowed to get?
Wow. We've talked about this before. When I was a young girl on the cult in Alaska, my father had asked CPS, or whatever they call it, the social worker, to come out. She talked to me and my sister each alone. And I have to tell you that even alone, I was terrified. Well, first, the cult leaders pumped us up that this was a great opportunity for us to fight for God's army, to defend our mother against the demons that my father was sending our way. So we were love bombed first. But there's such a great conflict that happens in your brain as a kid, where you want to tell so bad. Everything in my mind was screaming, just tell her, you hate it here, you want to go live with your father, please take me away. But the fear and the guilt hold you frozen. So at that time, I would have been around maybe 10 or 11. And so I am wondering, even if the cult leader had not sat in with those children, I imagine that the fear and the guilt would have still possibly made them say, we're okay. But if these social workers were trained in watching body language, the fact that I couldn't raise my head up, I was scuffing my feet, my shoulders were down, looking at these children's body language and how are they acting in association with their words. Too bad that social worker or whomever came in could not have really looked at that and demanded that that person not be in the room. And why didn't that happen?
I don't know why it didn't happen, and we've asked for the investigation to be reopened, and the local DSS says they're not going to do it. So, but what happened? Let me address that situation where you're talking about maybe the coaching of the leaders of the group for the children when the authorities come in to ask questions. March 6th, the Associated Press released an article, and inside that article was reports that former members confirmed meetings inside of the Jane Whaley's office where not only in the Matthew Fenner case, but in the Michael Lowry case, which happened a couple of years ago, there was collusion and coaching of the testimony to those who were possibly subject to interrogation by the authorities. And Jane Whaley directed that there were assistant DAs that were members of the church that were involved in those meetings who have since been removed from their positions. That was one of the fallouts of that article in March of this past year. They were actually, it's in the article reported that the assistant DAs were coaching people on how to avoid prosecution.
Wow, that is unbelievable. And so based on that, they won't go back in and begin another investigation since that investigation was tainted?
I am not privileged. I am not aware of another investigation officially launching because of that particular story or because of those meetings. I just know that the social worker that was a part of the church that was a part of those meetings, she's no longer employed with the department she was with, and the two assistant DAs are no longer employed with their jobs because the AP reported their participation in coaching members on how to avoid prosecution and how to answer authorities and children when they were asked questions.
So did those people leave on their own accord or were they fired?
The official report coming out for the social worker was that she decided to leave her job and pursue other options. The official word for the two assistant DAs is that they were no longer employed. They didn't actually use the word fired.
Right, because I would imagine that if they fired them, they would have to couple that with another investigation. But if those people were forced to resign, then they could say, well, they left on their own accord.
Right. Well, their supervisor in the position they were in did say that the State Bureau of Investigation was investigating the reports by the Associated Press. But where that investigation stands, it's not clear.
Which would make sense from an investigative, or a law enforcement perspective, that they would keep things quiet of what they were looking at, just so people can't hide evidence. But I guess the question remains is, are they really looking? I mean, it seems to be one of the most difficult things to get the FBI, the local police, when it comes to these churches, to go in and take a look at what's going on. I mean, even after a case like Matthew Fenner, you would just think that they would be busting that place wide open to look at the care of the children.
You would. The update on the Matthew Fenner case is the Covington trial resulted in a mistrial. Her attorney suffered a physical injury, and her possible next court date is maybe not even before December. Adam Bartley is the defendant up next. On the September 11th, there's supposed to be a hearing to decide some pretrial motions for Adam Bartley. Adam Bartley is a convicted felon and is incarcerated for some other infractions that happened after he left Word of Faith Fellowship after 2013. And I can understand why his case would come next.
They all have different attorneys, correct? All the defendants?
Right. That was one of the things that is such a delay from the original indictments were January of 15, but here we are in September of 17, and we've only had one trial that ends in a mistrial. The first year in 2015, the group attorneys, the church attorneys, tried to represent all 5 defendants. And the local assistant DA objected to it. And in August of 15, a judge disqualified that firm from representing any of them. So all 5 of them had to have separate attorneys, and that process took a little bit because the attorneys that were disqualified appealed to the state of North Carolina Court of Appeals. And that appeal languished in legal whatever until shortly after February of 2016, when Sarah Anderson left the group. When she left the group, the appeal fell apart because it was based on supposed familial ties, which was a bogus basis because Brooke Covington, Justin Covington, and Sarah Covington, at that time was Sarah Covington Anderson. Brooke was never adopted those 2, and was never the blood kin mother. And the defense of the group attorneys was based on a case where there was blood kin between a father and a son. I don't get off in the weeds, but it's all part of the long process to bring these trials to, the courtroom. So that's one of the reasons 2015 was like that. 2016 was full of motions and counter motions, and
I'm curious about something because I noticed this when I, was inside the cult, that the main person, and in my case, his name was Sam Fife, and I wanted to ask you this about Jane Whaley. After she really got her, underdog set, right? I don't know what she called them. My ex-cult called them the Father Ministry. They did the dirty work for him. He was like the celebrity who would kind of show face occasionally, and oh my gosh, Sam Fife is coming, and the best food was, cooked, and like he was a celebrity, everything was laying out. Has she gotten to that point where, like, for instance, with Matthew Fenner, she wasn't present, correct?
No, she was not one of the ones named in that prayer session. You're right. So,
does she purposely keep herself out of certain things so she can't be prosecuted?
I can't say that she purposely does it. I know there are instances where she administers correction and rebuke personally. But anybody who is familiar with the pyramid structure of a closed subculture, like a religious cult like we're talking about, knows that level of prayer and correction would not be going on without constant communication between Brooke Covington and Jane Whaley.
Right. And the only way for them to reveal that would be for someone to talk. So would you say that she kind of wasn't present at the most violent ones?
No, she wasn't.
So, and that seems to be like a common denominator. That's why I'm asking these questions, because I noticed that about Sam Fife too. He was the giver of the instructions. This is how you beat a child. This is how you do an exorcism. He did this very grand exorcism on this woman that you can hear on YouTube, which really pushed his celebrity status within the cult up even higher. But yeah, it was more like that, where he was getting his underdogs to do most of the dirty work. And in an even more sicker way, it gave them a feeling of more importance. So yeah. I don't know if you saw that same hierarchy where those in the position to be able to dole out punishment beneath her, their egos would pump up even more. And that's a very sick thing, that, oh, I get to do the punishing, so that means I'm important.
Well, you're carrying out the will of God as administered by the cult leader. And so that, you're right, that is a part of the process of promotion within the pyramid, knowing you'll never be at the top. but you may gain another level of authority, so to speak,
Right.
by following orders to carry out instructions from the leader.
Do you think that she gave the instruction? I mean, then of course we're totally hypothesizing here, but what you know, okay, so they get the clue in that, hey, Matthew may be gay. Would someone make a phone call to her and say, this has just been reported to us, how should we handle it?
Oh, absolutely. I can give you an example. It's in the first part of my book, in a meeting that I was in that started accelerated my separation from the group. Brooke Covington administered the meeting, but she was in touch with Jane Whaley, and Jane Whaley made an appearance in the meeting because she was informed of what was going on, and I wasn't agreeing, and that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
So, is it strange to think that Brooke Covington would actually call Jane Whaley during that meeting? No, it's not strange to think that at all.
Would Jane have dictated possibly how he should be, like how they moved him back and forth between, the physical abuse and the mental abuse, and using that structure? Would she have said to do that, or would she have given them free rein to make their own choices on how to handle it?
It is more likely that she would orchestrate from a distance. I mean, I was not there. You're right. It's just an hypothesis, but going on previous incidences and previous scenarios, and there is a recording, and I'm trying to remember if it's on the AP website or if it's on another Facebook page, where Jane is recorded as saying, you should throw them to the ground and get those devils out.
And the court is not using that, or do they have that as evidence?
Well, certainly if that's public, which I think it is, I think it's on the AP site, then the courts are aware of it. And if it's a part of the investigation that was referred to by Jill Rose, I don't know. But I know that anything that goes into the public arena is subject to being used in investigation, I would think.
Mm-hmm. So it's possible that that recording could lead maybe to charges being brought directly against her.
Could. I mean, there's a lot of audio out there. There was a particular group that before they left the church, they recorded her, several of the sessions where she screamed. I mean, those have been out in the news and other sources, where she would raise her voice to a controlling, screaming level. And for those that look at the church on the outside and see the nice cars, nice homes, big nice clothes, big jewelry, whatever, see, that doesn't make sense.
Mm-hmm.
That level of vicious verbal abuse would happen in a place that looks so pristine and nice. That's where the confusion, I think, resides with the local residents.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there's the reputation inside the community that a lot of the businesses owned by the church members give good service. There's a cafe that serves good food, and we don't want to stop going to the cafe at the mall, which is there in Forest City, because they have church members that work there, because the food is so nice. I mean, that's the kind of reasoning that I hear within that community.
The same thing in Delta Junction, Alaska, where the cult I was on, they own so many businesses, Rika's Roadhouse, Jewels of Sheba. But yes, to get the locals to get Americans to boycott anything, knowing that there's bad practices, is a difficult thing to do. But I would never support businesses that I knew were associated with abuse in any way, human trafficking. Has anybody ever picketed?
Has anybody ever picketed?
Mm-hmm. Or protested or anything in front of their church?
I did back in 11 and 12.
Were you standing alone?
I started by myself, and then from time to time, occasionally others would come stand with me. I got shut down because the cult reported that it was causing a traffic hazard. People were stopping to read my signs.
Yeah, I had somebody ask me about protesting a little while ago, and I said, make sure you keep your signs really short and simple so that they
Yeah,
can be read in about 3 to 4 seconds.
exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Um, it is difficult, and a lot of these cults, they take over really small towns like Bowens Mill, Georgia. They have incorporated that town as their own, so the cult basically owns the town. And when a cult owns a town and owns most of the businesses within that town, in some ways it's hard to boycott, right? That people are kind of forced to. But yeah, when good food overrides, I'm not going to this business anymore because of the abuses they've doled out, that's very telling of a mindset.
Right. And I mean, there's also the aspect that this group has recruited heavily in the local prisons, brought prisoners with violent records into their group.
So, John, before we went into the break, we were talking about the kids, and I know there's some child custody things that are going on that you wanted to touch on as well.
Yes, thank you, Vennie. Um, a common occurrence in the life of those inside the group is when one spouse leaves and the other one does not, and there are children of any age, especially minor children, that the custody issues have to be decided. A week ago, this past Thursday, I was encouraged or asked to come and stand with a man who's out of the group and was in court for a custody hearing for his little girl, and his wife at the time is in the group. Now, my purpose today is not to call their names. My purpose is to outline the general happenings and the dynamics and the destruction that happens when within the lives of the people that are involved in this group. It was no part of the bearing on this particular case is that the wife of this man, this young man, is the daughter of one of the leaders of the church. So it's a more visible custody case. But you have here a young man who is desperately trying to seek safety for his daughter and an equitable time sharing, if not full custody for the daughter. So when I arrived, the attorneys were still going through negotiations behind the scenes. I don't know if you're familiar with family court.
Oh,
Oftentimes,
yeah.
yeah, oftentimes things don't get litigated out in the open. They'll get
Hmm.
negotiated behind closed doors and then brought before a judge to sign a consent order.
Right.
And that's what happened in this particular case. There was negotiations back and forth, and finally, the wife's attorney was convinced to allow the father's stipulation to keep the young lady, the young girl, the infant child. She might, well, she might be a little bit less than 2,
Mm.
away from the prayer, away from the signature practice of the group.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I thought that was a very monumentous accomplishment by the attorney for the young man, because that is the signature practice of the group, allow prayer, and subjecting those children to that prayer is part of the indoctrination process, and part of the control process is exercised on the members of all ages.
Right.
But where the precedent for that case, for that stipulation came from is not only from the man's own understanding, but in a case earlier in the Anderson versus Anderson case. Now, what I'm about ready to tell you is already on my blog. It's public knowledge. But there was a Judge Powell who wrote a custody order, and in the custody order, there would be no shaking, yelling, or striking of the child. And that was the judge's way of telling both parents that the destructiveness of the prayer is not to be exercised over the child. And so that's an important step to get that judge on record for requiring that in that case.
Yeah.
And so this young man, this recent case, was able to build on that, it's my understanding, and to get that protection for his daughter. Now, I had someone who said, well, how's he going to know if the daughter's been prayed for? Well, he grew up in the prayer, and he knows the effects of the prayer on the behaviors and the key terms and the phrases. He'll be able to tell. And he'll be able to have the opportunity, if there's enough evidence, to cite the mother for contempt of court if there's evidence that the child's been subjected to that prayer.
So how does the mother keep, if the child is with the mother, full, you know, and the father has visitation and the mother is in the cult, the child can be subjected to surroundings that have prayer, but and tell me if I'm understanding this right, it's just that the child cannot have prayer directed towards the child directly?
Well, in this particular case, I didn't get to read the consent order, but it was my understanding it would not be around or subject to the prayer. The exact words of the consent order I did not get to read. That's a good point to make. I'll have to ask.
Right.
But at least not be subject to the prayer. So,
I mean, that's a difficult thing, you know, and that's something that I've talked about with religious parents, because, you know, an adult has the right to choose what they believe, but a child also has the right to a free mind and to develop their own belief systems, whatever that may be, on their own. And it does put the parents in an odd position, if they're very religious, how to keep their children separate so their children can have a free mind. It's hard for the child as well, because if the whole family, let's say, is Christian and they pray before meals, they go to church every Sunday, if that child doesn't adhere to that, even if they don't want to, you're the odd person out. You're shunned, you're not a part of the family. Sometimes the family's disowned. So there's a compliance too that happens with that belief system. But I don't know if they've created a special daycare where the children who aren't supposed to be subjected to certain things are taken, maybe to play, because the child is very young, right?
right.
But old enough to talk.
Excuse me?
The child is talking, can talk.
Yes, I believe so. And so that is another help for the father to know what's going on with the child. And I bring it up because it's a common situation inside or with the group that I was a part of with the custody hearings for these young children, because there was a group of young people that came up all about the same time and got married and started having children, and some left and some didn't, and one spouse would leave and one would stay. And it's not something that people think about a lot when they think about a religious cult, because they're thinking about other types of abuses. But what was the future of this child was hanging in the balance today. The parents were involved in their drama, trying to do their own thing, but what I don't believe, they may not have comprehended what I've seen over the years, is how critical that particular session was for their attorneys to be informed, their attorneys to know how to negotiate. And I mean, it was very important.
And also to set a precedence for other parents who may decide to leave that group and there's children involved. Now there is a court case directly pointing that says, hey, you know, this is what we did in this case, so we can do this. It's just surprising that the father didn't get custody. You know, what the judge's reasoning, or do they have, and I don't know if you know this, whether they have joint or if the father was just granted visitation. And
It's my understanding in this case it was joint custody.
Okay.
I think he was going for full, but I don't know how it is in other states, but in North Carolina, it's very difficult to pull a mother from custody of a child unless she has a criminal record or is involved in illegal activities.
Mm-hmm.
And in a lot of judges' mind, being accused of being in a religious cult is not an illegal activity. It's not a dangerous activity because a lot of judges don't understand.
Yeah, and I'm a I'm a father advocate. I mean, I think there's a lot of children that would be better off with their dads. I don't necessarily think that it should be a default that a child is only with their mother. I mean, I don't want to ever see a child pulled from any parent. However, if there's that type of mind control going on and the child is not allowed to have a free thinking life, a free thinking mind, then they need to be put in an environment where they're safer. But I think joint custody is great. The child will be able to be with its father away from the cult, and it is good that that precedent was set, hopefully to protect children in the future.
Yes, yes, and that's one of the reasons, or one of the things that my participation or my involvement in getting the word out about this group has evolved into covering the court cases on my blog. And it's not something that I set out to do. It's just more of something that came before me, and I chose that particular role one day at a time, one case at a time, one court hearing at a time. And I do find that there are people that, of course, can't come to the hearings because of their work schedule, and they appreciate the opportunity to read about it on my blog.
Yeah, your blog is really great. I mean, that's where I saw, some of the video and stuff. So it is a good place to stay abreast. And I wanted to ask you, what is happening going forward with the Brazilian cases? Have those people been rescued and been able to go back home, given their passports back? What's happening in court with that?
Here's what I know so far. And some of this comes from information leaking out of the group, that those who had visas or visas that would soon expire were sent back to Brazil. There was an effort to cover up any wrongdoings made inside the group, which follows, previous behavior patterns. I mean, nobody should be shocked at that. Um, I know the Brazilian consulate has been involved in talking with Jill Rose's office, and that's been in the media. I know the Brazilian consulate put out a word to anybody that was either inside or outside the group that was Brazilian, that they would help them get their papers and get them back to Brazil.
Why can't they just get the passports back? Just demand the passports back?
Well, I'm not saying they can't, and I've been told that when the article broke, that all of a sudden everybody got their passports. So that was that's just what I was told. I've got no way to confirm that, but it stands to reason because of other behaviors that in order to cover up or right a perceived wrong, that they would give them back their passports.
And then are there some of the Brazilian members who support her, or do the majority of them feel very mistreated?
No, not everybody is. No, there are still some Brazilians that are very loyal to Jane Whaley. So it's not a complete, in a group that large, in a population that's that varied in ages and experiences. See, that's one of the things, I know you know this inside of a group, that not everybody experiences the same treatment.
Mm-hmm.
It's on a, knowledge is dispersed on an as needed basis.
Mm-hmm. And there's very classism as well.
The classes of members, you mean?
Well, like for instance, in the cult I was in, like say you were someone who came from money, your family was wealthy, you might be really good elder, a really good candidate to be an elder. So because you had a resource that was valuable to them. So they're going to give you a little bit of power.
Exactly.
So there's this classist system. Whereas, for instance, my family, we were the worker bees, the slaves, because my mother was a divorced woman with 3 children, and she didn't have anything to offer the cult except for strenuous labor. So I imagine there's that same system that goes on within the WOFF cult as well.
Exactly. I have no information to contradict that. In fact, I was a little confused with your word. I've called it in my writings before a caste system.
Yeah.
And it is strictly those who come from money have less restrictions. Those who are higher up in the leadership pyramid may have televisions in their home and have free access to things that other members that aren't quite walking with God the way that the leadership is, or can't resist the draw of the sin that the leadership could. So inside of a pyramid structure like that, you're right. Not only it's money flows up and fear flows down, and but restrictions closer to the top are less, and they can go on vacations. And there's been reports of people in leadership having jet skis of all things, which were not allowed for regular members, and privileges to go to the beach and whatever with regular members wouldn't be allowed to do. So yes, there's what I like to call a caste system inside that group. And so not all Brazilians were treated like that. If they had money, then, and Jane wanted to protect the contributions or the influence that person could wield, then they may not have been called or required to go on the quote-unquote night projects where young men would work until 1, 2, possibly 2:30, 3 o'clock in the morning on renovating a building or renovating a home. And sorry, we got some emergency vehicles coming by here.
That's okay. We'll let them pass.
So, and how this is going to play out, I'm not really sure. I know that Jill Rose's statement recently is that the investigation has gotten traction. Well, that's vague to one point, but it sounds positive to another. So,
well, big kudos to, you know, the Associated Press for picking up this story, where the mainstream media obviously won't give it the time of day, and digging in like they have. I mean, that is super incredible and important that these, you know, other news outlets are showcasing these stories, because the American people have the right to know what's happening in our country and how religious money is being used to place politicians in certain positions so that those religious institutions can make some laws and rules, and that's just not okay.
No, it's not. And, I don't know, from my position and what I've been involved in since I left in 2008, and when I started my blog in 2010, from my position, I have no words to entirely express my gratitude to the Associated Press for the, I mean, nearly 2 years that they've devoted to this story. And they're not finished.
Right.
So it is, I mean, I don't know who the ultimate person was who said, yes, go forward with the project, but I hope to meet that person one day and shake their hand.
Yeah, it's really difficult to get the news to look at these cults, because it's almost like they're afraid, oh, we don't want to attack religion. But you're not attacking religion. You're attacking a system that's using religion to abuse people. So it's just very baffling and frustrating. I mean, especially to know how many cults are out there and the children that are on there, and the news just really, like I told you, I did an interview with NBC and it never made the news.
Right.
They dropped the story. Another one of my cult survivors did an interview with NBC. They dropped the story. everybody drops the story when they see certain connections, especially if those connections have anything to do with politics or the government or lobbying money or anything like that. They just don't want to touch it. And how are we ever going to end this problem if they're unwilling to look at it? Because it could be solved with awareness so that people will know what's going on inside these groups.
Let me mention something. If you brought up the subject of politics and religion and the mixing and the dangers of the two, but this week I was made aware of a video that I'll post on my blog. It's a YouTube link that I'll hopefully be able to embed. There's a group member named Lee Valentine who's very heavily active in the local Republican Party, who's been appointed to the Faith Advisory Council for President Trump. And I was made aware of a video where she explains that, and it was a puff piece, puffing her up and her background and her access to the president and that kind of thing. But she's an active cult member, and her son has a law practice in Shelby, North Carolina. Mm-hmm. He's still active in the group. He's actually in partnership with another cult attorney. And in the piece itself, from what I was able to gather, they mentioned all these other things except her involvement in Word of Faith Fellowship.
Yeah, there's a senator in Alaska who attended church, recently, and I remember that I sent her an email, just wanting to talk to her and asked her, can we have some email exchange here? I want you to know, like, what the background is of where you're going, what happened to us kids, what you're attending was built, like the horror it was built off of. She refused to do any type of emailing back and forth with me. She would only talk with me on the phone, which I knew was a trick, because then she could hang up, and it wouldn't be in writing.
Right. Well, I knew that this particular person was active. One of the citations of so-called accolades, or an accolade that she received in this video, was that she had opened 7 Trump rallies with prayer and exhortation in the North Carolina area. Mm-hmm. And that, I'm sorry, I just had some very disturbing thoughts about how someone could be appointed to the advisory council to the president and still be involved in a group like this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's to me a constitutional violation on a widespread level to use religion in politics, period. I mean, it violates separation of church and state. It just should not be done. I don't care what religious leaning, or it shouldn't matter what religious leaning a politician has, but instead, what are they going to do for the people? But it seems like that's really switched. John, thanks for being here with me. It's over. It went by too fast.
Thanks for joining me, Vennie Kocsis, and remember, get through it, don't stay in it.